So hello again, class. We're here doing chapter 13, part 4. Here we have gone through. We're talking about the peripheral nervous system and the role that it plays in sensing and the role that it plays in connecting our central nervous system to our external environment, right? All right, so now we've talked about the anatomy of the peripheral nervous system. Now we want to get into the actual physiology, like what role does it play in sensation and what role does it play in motor, right? Remember, we've talked about the spinal cord, the gray matter, white matter, the 31 pairs of spinal nerves, 12 cranial nerves. We've mentioned the anterior root with the motor function, posterior root, where you have your sensory. Those two combine to make the spinal nerve. That doesn't happen necessarily in the cranial nerves. In the cranial nerves, they don't have an anterior and posterior that come together. Some of those can be motor, some of those can be mixed, some of those can be just sensory, depending on the cranial nerve. But in your spinal nerves, you have all mixed. Remember, so you have motor and sensory in each one. Once the anterior and posterior combine make the spinal nerve, then you can split off into your anterior rami and your posterior rami. All right. So we talked about that. We talked about the structure of the spinal nerve. Spinal nerve is actually bundles of axons. Remember, the cell bodies are in, now I can't remember the word, in the ganglion, posterior root ganglion, that little lump there, that's where the cell bodies are for the nerve cells, and the axons are actually what extends into the spinal nerve. And that's what we look at when we talk about nerves. We're talking about bundles of nerve cell axons bundled together, a whole bunch of them, right? All right, so let's keep going. Now, what role does that play in sensation? And 13.5 is what role it plays in motor. And then we kind of sum it up at the end with like reflexes and stuff, okay? So I'll be kind of moving my image around as we go through this, okay? So what we have here, remember, from PNS to CNS. So stimuli are first detected by your sensory neurons. So I touch something, I touch something, my sensory neurons sense, and that's the first detection that my body has that I'm touching something. That stimulus is transmitted from my PNS to my CNS. CNS, remember, is brain, spinal cord. Stimulus is integrated. Remember, with it, integrated by your interneurons, neurons that don't sense or do motor. So all the other neurons are your interneurons, interpreted by your CNS. And then we know what we're going to get into the next section, the signal that's sent back down to do the motor. Okay, so stimuli first detected by sensory neurons, part of your PNS. Remember, your brain and your spinal cord don't do any sensing or don't do any direct sensing or direct motor. All of the sensing and the motor has to be done through the peripheral nervous system, through the cranial nerves, through the spinal nerves, right? The central nervous system just is the control center, okay? So just remember all of these terms as, you know, we kind of put the whole picture together, right? So sensory transduction, you'll see that term here. Stimulus is converted into an electrical signal. So I touch, you know, I'm touching this. This is a drumstick my kids play with. You know, I'm touching these drumsticks, right? But my brain is not touching the drumsticks. That signal from the touching of these drumsticks you know, and the ability to play the drum, that signal is being, so I'm touching the drumstick, signal is being transferred to my peripheral nervous system, my brachial plexus, into my cranial, sorry, not cranial, cervical, into the cervical section of my spinal cord, then up into my brain, brainstem, cerebrum, to my cortexes, and that signal, so that it's going from a physical touch, that signal is being transduced, it's being converted into an electrical signal that is transferred to my brain. My brain is not physically touching these, but my brain is telling my body that it's physically touch. It's converting the signal from this touch into my nerves converted into an electrical signal that my brains can process and tell me that you are touching wooden drumsticks. Okay, so that's the amazing part. It's one of the amazing parts of the nervous system. I can touch something soft, something wet, and my body turns that into an electrical signal that is transferred through my nervous system to my brain and processed, and it says, okay, that's something wet, that's something soft, that's something hard, that's something wooden, that's something hot, that's something cold. So it has to convert that physical touch into a specific electrical signal, right? So how does that process happen? That's sensory transduction. Okay? So ion channels in the axolemma are closed. Stimulus is detected by the sensory receptor. Sodium ion channels open. Sodium ions flow into the axoplasm. Temporary depolarization. So you remember this whole process of depolarization. If enough sodium ions enter, we have what we call that action potential. Remember, -55 action potential, and it's propagated along the axon toward the CNS. So if I touch something and those sensory neurons touch something enough to where we get an action potential, it'll be propagated along the CNS and it'll report to my brain, okay, you're touching something. See here, it says rapidly adapting receptors respond rapidly with high intensity stimuli. Stop sending after a certain period of time, called adaptation. So like if I leave my hand on this, if I leave this stick, if I leave it against my shoulder, eventually I'll stop feeling this stick. I mean, I feel it, like if I keep touching myself like this, I'll keep feeling it. But if I just leave it here and talk, eventually I won't even feel it. My body won't even send the signal anymore. That's called adaptation. My nerves are adapted. Just like when I said in class, you may not even, until you think about it sometimes, you don't even realize you're wearing clothes. I mean, you're wearing clothes, obviously, because it would be inappropriate not to, but you don't feel the clothes. Your body has adapted to the clothing that you're wearing. So you're not, even though you still have a signal, it's adapted over a certain period of time. And that ongoing stimulus of that, the clothes actually physically touching your skin, gets ignored, right? And then there's some receptors that slowly adapting receptors respond to stimuli with constant action potentials and don't diminish over time, right? So we'll talk about those as well, right? So look, this is a great example. Something is touching the fingertip. It causes the sodium channels to open. If the sodium channels on the axon to open, at the axolemma, before any stimulus arrives, the ion channels and axolemma of the somatic sensory neurons are closed. So before you touch something, the axons are closed. But as you touch something, stimulus, you have, something pushes on your finger in this example, the mechanically gated sodium channels, so you push on something pushes on you, you touch something, those sodium channels open up and they convert that pressure from that touch by opening the channels, is converted into sodium ions flowing in, that's an electrical signal, ions flowing in, depolarization. So the ions open up. If the stimulus is strong enough ion channels will open, you'll have an action potential. okay? And that potential will go down the axon, and that signal will go from your PNS to your spinal cord, your CNS to your brain, and you'll be able to interpret, okay, this thing is poking me. All right? Action potential. All right, so classification of sensory receptors. Now there's different types of receptors. Mechanically gated ion channels, that was, it's a simple concept. Different sensory receptors exist. Encapsulated nerve endings surrounded by specialized supportive cells, free nerve endings, lack supportive cells, right? Sensory receptors can be sorted by the location of the stimuli they detect. So you have different receptors for different stimuli, okay? The receptors that sense your sense of touch and the receptors that are sensing your sensing changes in temperature are a little bit different. Exteroceptors, usually close to the body's surface, detect stimuli originating from outside the body. Interoceptors, usually found within the body's interior, detect stimuli originating from within the body. And I didn't highlight these terms, but it's just good to kind of know that your body your body adapts to different stimuli. You can detect different stimuli with different types of receptors. Right, so this, I do kind of want you to know this slide, as you see, I put it in red, right? So the first one we talked about were the mechanoreceptors, mechanically gated ion channels, right? So they depolarize when tissue is deformed, right? So I push on the edge of my finger, those mechanically gated channels open up, allow sodium to flow in. If the push is hard enough, they'll depolarize, -55, send the action potential, tell my brain, it'll process something's touching my finger, right? But you also have what we call thermoreceptors. Those are exteroreceptors, mostly exteroreceptors focus on things outside the body. Slow adapting receptors. Notice that slow adapting receptor, if you're physically cold, it takes a while for your body to adapt. Right? So it's a slow adapting receptor. If I stand outside in the cold, I'm going to be cold and I'm going to keep feeling cold and keep feeling cold and keep feeling cold. Now I may eventually get used to it, depending on how cold it is, or I may not. They are slow adapting receptors, not like the receptors, some of these mechanoreceptors. All right. So mechanoreceptors, touch, stretch, pressure. Thermoreceptors, respond to changes in your temperature, hot and cold. Chemoreceptors, they can be intero or exteroreceptors, so inside the body or on the surfaces of the body, depolarize with specific chemicals. Photoreceptors, only in the eye, depolarize with response to light, right? Respond to light. So I see something different, sends a signal to my brain. Nocioreceptors, usually slowly adapting receptors to polarize in response to noxious stimuli. Okay. Right. This is specifically classes of mechanoreceptors, right? So mechanoreceptors, they mechanically respond. This pressure, touch, stretch, pressure, touch, vibration. Sorry, that's the other one I was thinking of. So different types of mechanoreceptors can respond to different ways. You have the Merkel cell fibers. Remember those? We talked about those when we talked about the integumentary system in your epidermal ridges. Remember the epidermis, the upper layer of your skin, fingertips, Merkel cell fibers. Receptors potentials are generated by mechanically gated ion channels. You have tactile corpuscles in your dermal papillae. We talked about that in the dermal layer. The top layer of your dermal layer. These are rapidly adapting to different touch. All right, so these are the ones that are rapidly adapting. This is why these tactile corpuscles are the reason why you don't feel your clothes quickly after putting them on. Ruffini endings, slowly adapting receptors to stretch and movement, right? Lamellated corpuscles, rapidly adaptive receptors deep within your dermis. Notice how all these are in your skin. detect high frequency vibration, deep pressure stimuli, your hair follicles. Everybody knows your hair is sensitive, free nerve endings, respond to stimuli that cause hair to bend. So, you know, if a breeze causes the hair on your skin to bend, you'll sense that. Proprioceptors in your musculoskeletal system detect movement and position of joint or body part. Okay, so different ways we can detect different things: pressure, touch, stretch, movement, deep pressure, the air that blows across our skin. I remember one time somebody said to me, this client of mine was talking about her husband, and she was saying, if I had to lose one of my senses, which one would I miss the most? And she said she would miss not sight, not taste, not hearing, but she would miss the touch, miss her husband's touch the most. Just, you know, touching her skin, or touching, you know, what if you couldn't feel that, you know, whether it's pressure, somebody holding your hand, whether it's just gently touching, just moving the hairs on your skin. It's just, you know, we're very sensitive to touch. There's many different ways our mechanoreceptors can be stimulated, and we can communicate via touch. I was listening to somebody talk just a day or two ago, and he was talking about some of the struggles when we were, when we first switched over to these online classes. They were saying, make sure you provide a way for any students who have, you know, issues, like if you were blind, if you couldn't hear, you know. I don't think there's anybody in our class that is blind or can't hear. If there are, please let me know. But you know, so they were saying, like, for people who are blind, the touch is how they see. So touching, you know, with touching, they can see, and, you know, they can hear, like you can describe to them things, and they can touch things, and they can, and that makes up a lot for not being able to see. But there's a lot of power in the touch, right? And so this is just a diagram of some of those structures located in the skin and responsible for different ways of sensing. All right, this is an interesting slide. I always like to talk about types of thermoreceptors. We have cold receptors. Notice how cold receptor is 10 degrees Celsius to 4 degrees Celsius, which is like 50 to 104 degrees Fahrenheit in superficial dermis. And then hot receptors respond to temperatures between 90 to 118 degrees Fahrenheit. And they're deep in the dermis. Temperatures outside these ranges are detected by nociceptors. And I didn't talk about that in detail. Nociceptors, that I didn't mention it before, but now you'll see that those are your receptors for pain. So if something is too cold or too hot, your body doesn't interpret it as hot or cold per se. It interprets it as pain. So below 10 degrees Celsius, below or above 48 degrees Celsius, your body basically interprets that as pain. Okay? If something is too cold or something is too hot, it's just interpreted as pain when it gets into your body. So if, you know, you're cold, and if your body's cold, you grab a piece of, what do they call it? Dry ice or whatever they call it. It's not, you don't just, that's why it kind of hurts when you grab it. Or if you put your hand in fire, you don't just say, oh, this fire is hot. You say, ouch, because that's outside of the range that your body interprets as hot or cold. And if it's outside of that range, your body just calls it pain. That's how it's interpreted in your brain. And why does it do that? Because it could potentially injure you. So that's how our brains are wired to interpret it. Then when we do touch something that is in that hot or too hot or too cold range, we go into our sympathetic nervous system, which we're going to talk about eventually. you get into that fight or flight mode, and you snap the hand away. Ooh, that's cold. Ooh, that's hot. You know, because it's too hot or too cold and it hurts. Right. So that's a protective mechanism built into your body. Amen. I mean, oops, sorry. So I get excited sometimes. I forget sometimes where I am. But yeah, we're doing church and stuff online and via Zoom as well. So sorry, I get a little. Sometimes I'm mixing the two up. I was just praying on a conference call earlier. Okay. Anyways, all right, let's keep going. Hopefully everybody's doing well today. All right, sensory neurons. All right, so you have first order somatic sensory neurons, or pseudo. Remember we talked about different types of neurons before. I think it was in chapter 11. But you can have pseudo unipolar neurons. Three main components. Right, you have the cell body. Cell bodies of spinal nerves are in the posterior dorsal root ganglion. We talked about that. And posterior root, the ganglion, little swollen section right there where you have the cell bodies, just lateral to the spinal cord. Cell bodies of cranial nerves are in the cranial nerve ganglia in the head and neck. And peripheral process, okay, long axon that transmits action potential from source of stimulus to neuron central process. And then the central process exits cell body, travels through posterior root, entered the spinal cord at posterior horn, where they deliver their action potentials. Okay, so it's just showing you the structure of the sensory neuron, right? Structure of the sensory neuron and how it delivers a signal. And how does the information flow? So peripheral process transmits action potential. Peripheral process transmits action potential from sensory receptor. So from the receptor, like in your skin, to the neuron's central process. Central process transmits action potential from peripheral process to posterior horn. So going into the spinal cord, eventually synapsing on the second order neuron. That would be considered an interneuron as well. In the spinal cord, so it synapses with a neuron in the spinal cord and goes up towards the spinal cord or brainstem, and then that's going to lead into the potential propagated down the peripheral process. Does not generally reach the cell body, right? Pseudo unipolar, so it doesn't actually have the action potential doesn't have to go through the cell body. Instead, usually transmitted to the central process area where the peripheral and central processes come into contact near the cell body. So, right. So this is showing you the structure. So pseudo unipolar. All right. So the nerve the signal is detected here, action potential goes along. Instead of going into the cell body, oops, where did my thing go? Instead of going into the cell body, it goes near the cell body, and then the action potential just continues right along into the spinal cord or the brain stem, and that's how it'll go into the brain. All right, depending on which where this nerve is located, where this sensory neuron is located. So this is the peripheral process, cell body, central process of somatic sensory nerve, and obviously this is your spinal cord, right? This is anterior, posterior. Remember, sensory happens in the posterior root, motor happens in your anterior root, okay? All right. Sensory neurons are classified by two factors that determine speed with which the peripheral axons contain action potentials. When you think of speed and think of sending a signal in the nervous system, hopefully the first thing that pops into your mind is myelination. We talked about that, right? But two factors determine the speed: diameter of the axon, so how wide that axon is, and thickness of its myelin sheath. Okay, remember the myelin sheath is the insulation. So large diameter axons with thick myelin sheaths conduct fast impulses. So you have the axon is big, the myelin sheath is thick, so you have good insulation. The impulse will move fast. All right, so they conduct proprioceptive information and convey discriminative and non-discriminative touch information. So touch, proprioception, or move fast. Small diameter axons, so smaller axons with little myelin, so they have less myelin, little myelin, transmit slower action potentials. Makes sense. And they carry pain and temperature. So those tend to move a little bit slower through the axons. And then we have this last slide which talks about just kind of receptive fields. Right? The skin and the fingertips has many sensory neurons, so they can, very sensitive. Skin of the forearm has fewer neurons, so it's not as sensitive. So your fingertips are made basically to touch things and to send information, while your forearm, obviously if something touches you on your forearm, you still feel it, but it's not as efficient at sending touch information as your fingertips. That's why we touch things with our hands, with our fingers more so than with our forearms. I know everybody's saying, like, after this whole COVID-19 thing, that people are going to stop shaking hands and stop touching things, is everything going to become like no doorknob and stuff like that? Well, let's wait and see. But our hands are designed to touch. Now, whether we shake hands or not, I don't know if that's right. It's going to change or not, but touch is important. Our bodies are designed to touch, right? So hopefully you see that here, and to see, how we have more free nerve endings, more sensory receptors in our fingertips. Like, we're designed to touch things with our hands, right? And this is just showing you a diagram of, mechanoreceptors sensing, sends the signal, goes into the peripheral process, then the central process of the axon, and then it goes into the spinal cord and then up to the brain. And that'll go to the cerebral cortex, the section responsible for sensing, right? And that's connecting your PNS with your CNS, which will tell you, okay, this is what I'm touching. All right, thank you very much.